Hey there. Tonight, we're not marching through battlefields or decoding ancient codes. We're stepping into a quieter story, one told not with swords or scrolls, but with silence. With stillness. With a gaze that lingers too long, and a world that once looked away. This isn't a tale about glory or conquest. It's about the ones history forgot to write about. The children who arrived with an extra chromosome and found themselves pushed to the margins. But they kept smiling. They kept living. And eventually, they changed everything. So if stories like this give your mind a soft place to land, or just help the night feel less lonely, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to you. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it? It's always comforting to know these quiet stories are finding homes across the world. Now settle in. Let the world fall away. And walk with me into the shadows of old hospitals, candlelit homes, and crowded classrooms. Where every small kindness felt like a revolution. Close your eyes. And listen. Long before the written word carved permanence into clay or parchment, long before we drew lines between science and spirit, there were only eyes, human eyes, watching a child who did not move like the others. A child whose gaze lingered too long, whose smile arrived slower, softer, as if time itself bent differently for them. There were no diagnoses then. No names. Just reactions. And in those reactions, we catch glimpses of ourselves, what we feared, what we cherished, what we could not understand. The story begins not in a textbook or hospital, but in the dirt, ancient, layered, and silent. In 2014, archaeologists in France brushed away centuries to reveal the small skeleton of a child buried with care. The bones were 1,500 years old. Yet what set them apart was not how they were placed, but how they were shaped. The rounded skull, the flattened nasal bridge, subtle signs that whispered a modern word into the ancient past, Down syndrome. And here is the detail that matters most: the burial was tender. There was no sign of shame, no hasty interment in a forgotten field. The child had been laid to rest in the same sacred ground as others, head to the east, offerings nearby, as though their soul, too, deserved safe passage. It's a quiet revelation, but a profound one. In a time with no language for chromosomes, someone had looked at this child and seen, not a curse, not an omen, but a person. Perhaps quieter, perhaps carried more often, perhaps watched with worry and wonder. But loved. Maybe even because of the difference, not in spite of it. This is where the history of Down syndrome truly begins, not in the laboratories of the 19th century, but in moments like this, hands placing bones in earth, hearts choosing inclusion over fear. The archaeological record, sparse though it is, offers more than artifacts. It offers testimony. And what it tells us is simple: people with Down syndrome have always been here. Always. Across continents, across centuries, more such burials emerge. In Roman tombs. In ancient settlements in the Andes. Children and adults, buried with reverence. Their bones echo a message across the silence of time: I was here. I mattered. And in these echoes, we find a challenge. To question the assumptions we inherited. To remember that even without words or science, there were always people who knew how to love. As we trace this story forward, we enter the classical world, the temples of Greece, the scrolls of Rome, the shrines of Egypt. A world not yet ruled by laboratories, but by myth and metaphor. A child who looked different might be interpreted not as ill, but as touched by gods, or cursed by fate. They might be feared. They might be revered. But rarely were they just people. Imagine the parents. A newborn in their arms. The features are soft, the eyes almond-shaped, the limbs a little loose. There are no tests, only the tightening of a midwife's mouth. Whispers in the village. The mother wonders, what star watched over this birth? What god has spoken? In ancient Hindu texts, children born with differences were sometimes seen as vessels of karma, souls returned to teach, or to learn. In Egyptian myth, children marked by the unusual were sometimes considered holy, blessed or burdened by the divine. In Greco-Roman tradition, they could be omens, of victory or catastrophe. And yet again, the record is not one story, but many. In some homes, a child with Down syndrome may have grown up quietly, fed by hand, spoken to gently, and woven into the daily rhythm of the household. In others, they may have been hidden, abandoned, or sent to live among the priests and oracles, thought to possess a connection beyond comprehension. There is no single truth. Only a spectrum of response, painted in shades of wonder, fear, and care. The one constant is this: the presence of people with Down syndrome in every chapter of the human story. They were not anomalies. Not accidents of modern medicine. They were always part of us. A thread in the vast and tangled tapestry of who we are. And so, as we stand here, looking back not through microscopes but through memory, we begin to understand something else, something quietly profound. Before there was diagnosis, there was response. And in those earliest responses, those gentle burials, those hesitant smiles, those whispered stories, we glimpse not only the beginnings of understanding, but the beginnings of something even more important. Dignity. Step into the marble avenues of ancient cities, Alexandria, Athens, Varanasi, Babylon, and you'll find a world where logic and superstition danced in constant tension. This was a time before the microscope but not before meaning. And when a child was born with Down syndrome, the world responded not with a diagnosis, but with myth. In the absence of science, there was metaphor. The unusual was sacred or suspect, rarely neutral. A child with gentle features and a slow gait might be seen as divine, touched by prophecy. Or as cursed, the bearer of ancestral sin. Every culture wrapped its mysteries in stories. And stories, for all their beauty, often cut both ways. In ancient Greece, philosophers debated the nature of perfection. The body was a vessel, meant to mirror the harmony of the cosmos. Plato spoke of ideal forms, Aristotle of natural order. Within such a framework, a child who didn't match the expected mold presented a puzzle. Some thinkers pitted such individuals. Others ignored them. But among everyday families, the response was far more intimate, far less theoretical. There are scattered references in ancient medical texts to soft children, to infants who cried less, who struggled to feed. Some were described as moon-faced or slow to sit upright. But their names are lost. Their lives, mostly unrecorded. And yet, now and then, we see their shadows in art. Look closely at certain mosaics in Roman villas. At small figures on the margins, angels with round faces, saints with eyes slightly tilted, children depicted with an innocence so precise it defies coincidence. Did the artist know someone like this? Was this memory, not imagination? In India, the Vedic tradition held space for reincarnation. A soul could return in countless forms, each life a lesson. Differences were not necessarily accidents, they were messages, signposts on a spiritual path. A child born with Down syndrome might be seen as the embodiment of purity, or as a soul sent to heal familial karma. This belief didn't erase suffering, but it changed its meaning. The child's life mattered, not because of what they could do, but because of who they were. Because they were. And in ancient Egypt, where death and divinity were woven into daily life, we find symbols everywhere. Scarabs, ankhs, falcons, and eyes, each etched in gold, each layered with meaning. Egyptian myth included stories of gods born under strange stars, of deities with hidden forms. A child who did not fit expectations could, in certain interpretations, be seen not as broken, but as otherworldly. Yet for every culture that revered the unusual, there were those that recoiled from it. Fear has always been a powerful instinct. And in societies where conformity equaled survival, the different were sometimes hidden. Or worse, erased. Infants left on temple steps. Children sent to live in isolation, watched but never truly seen. The difference between sanctuary and exile was often just a matter of geography, or the heart of a midwife. Still, even in these darker patterns, threads of compassion remain. In a Roman household, a grandmother might cradle the child others avoided. In a Himalayan village, a healer might chant prayers over a baby no one could explain. In a desert monastery, a scribe might write of a blessed innocent, who said little but smiled often. The record is fractured. It always is, when history is written by those in power. But if we read between the lines, not just of scrolls, but of burial sites, statues, whispered legends, we find something enduring. Presence. People with Down syndrome were not invented by modernity. They were not created by technology. They were born into every age, every faith, every climate. And every time, humanity faced a choice, to dismiss them as error, or to embrace them as mystery. Some did both. Some did neither. But always, the child was there. And here's the truth history teaches us if we're willing to listen: culture does not define worth. It only reflects it. What is sacred in one place is feared in another. What is silenced in one century is sung about in the next. But the soul? The soul remains unchanged. In the hearts of countless unnamed parents, a quiet revolution was already taking place. They held their child, saw the features others whispered about, and made a choice, not of science, not of doctrine, but of instinct. To love. The Middle Ages arrived not with sudden collapse, but with slow forgetting. Empires crumbled into kingdoms. Roads to knowledge overgrew with brambles. And for those born different, the world narrowed. From the 5th to the 15th century, Europe became a patchwork of feudal lands, village superstition, and unshakable theology. The Church grew in influence, and with it came new answers to old questions, answers that were often final, and often cruel. A child born with Down syndrome in this age faced not curiosity, but judgment. Without the language of genetics, without the shelter of science, people reached for what they had: scripture, sin, suspicion. Whispers passed through cobbled alleys. Was this child the punishment for a parent's hidden transgression? A sign of divine anger? A warning to the village? The answers depended less on truth than on fear. In rural communities, families might keep such children hidden, safe from stares, from gossip, from themselves. A small room at the back of the cottage. A seat near the hearth, but not at the table. The child was loved, perhaps, but also shielded. From others, and from the world's cruelty. In some cases, children were given to religious institutions, monasteries, convents, places where the outcast were collected under the banner of charity. These were not hospitals. They were sanctuaries and sometimes prisons. Within thick stone walls, children with intellectual disabilities lived lives of routine, morning prayer, bread, silence, evening bells. It was a strange paradox. The church saw the soul as sacred, but the body as suspect. A child who did not speak clearly, who could not memorize verses, was seen as spiritually pure, or spiritually dangerous. Some monastic orders offered quiet kindness. Monks recorded in fragile Latin the presence of innocents, souls untouched by the world, closer to God. In rare cases, these children were embraced. Taught simple prayers. Included in the rhythm of cloistered life. Their tasks were small, tending gardens, carrying candles, sweeping stone corridors. Their presence was tolerated, sometimes even cherished. But in most cases, there was only silence. We have little record of these lives. No letters. No portraits. Only the echo of footsteps on monastery floors, and a name, if it survived, scrawled in the margin of a parish book. Art tells us what documents do not. In rare medieval paintings, we see angels with rounded cheeks, saints with soft features, holy fools clad in humility. Were these symbols? Or portraits of the unseen? We may never know. Elsewhere in the world, the pattern was no more hopeful. In some Islamic societies, scholars wrote of mental difference, but often in clinical or dismissive terms. In feudal Japan, children born with visible disabilities were hidden. In the Americas, in pre-contact cultures, interpretations varied widely. Some revered such individuals, others abandoned them. But always, the response hinged on the same axis, what the culture feared, and what it hoped. Still, kindness flickered, even in shadow. A midwife might return, years later, to bring a child berries from the woods. A village healer might press a charm into the mother's palm, silent, but warm. A priest, tired of doctrine, might whisper that all life was sacred, even the lives others refused to see. And within families, in the privacy of thatched homes and stone cottages, there was sometimes something braver than faith. Love. The child with Down syndrome may not have learned to read. May never have spoken clearly. But they laughed. They sang nonsense to the cat. They knew the path to the well. They pressed their head against their mother's shoulder and sighed in contentment when the day grew cold. These were not stories that made it into chronicles. Chroniclers wrote of kings, of battles, of saints. But in the quiet hours of unwritten life, these children lived. Laughed. Were held. And were missed when they were gone. So much of history is loud. But this part is soft. And it is no less true. The Middle Ages are remembered as harsh. And for many, they were. But they also contained moments of defiance, not through revolt, but through gentleness. A mother who refused to hide her child. A brother who carried his sibling on his back to Massachusetts. A monk who carved a small wooden toy and left it at the foot of a bed. These are the acts that go undocumented. But they are the ones that shaped the future. Because every time someone chose kindness over fear, they preserved not only a life, but a truth. That being human is not a matter of intellect, or power, or perfection. It is a matter of presence. By the 17th century, the great engines of thought began to rumble anew. Europe stood on the cusp of change. The Renaissance had peeled open the mind. The Enlightenment would now try to measure it. It was the age of reason. Of telescopes and treatises. Of men in powdered wigs dissecting not only the body, but the soul. Humanity looked inward, and not always kindly. For people with Down syndrome, the world was shifting beneath their feet. Slowly, invisibly. Not yet in their favor. Science had begun to pull away from religion, but it hadn't yet reached compassion. What it gained in inquiry, it lacked in empathy. The child once seen as sacred or silent was now seen as deficient. Labeled. Catalogued. Pitted. But still, they were there. In portraits of European court life, we catch flickers of their presence. A young servant with soft features in the background of a painting. A child beside a noblewoman, dressed in lace but staring just beyond the painter's brush. These were not figments. They were real. But they were seldom named. Some served in households under vague titles: ward, fool, companion. Their differences were noted but not understood. They were fed, perhaps clothed well. But they were rarely educated, rarely documented. Their lives orbited others. They were the moon, not the sun. And as the century turned, medicine began to take notice, not with care, but curiosity. Physicians, mostly men of status, began collecting cases. Descriptions of idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness. Broad terms. Cold terms. The children described were observed like specimens, not students. Their mannerisms listed in journals. Their lives reduced to symptoms. Down syndrome had no name yet. But it was being watched. In 18th century France, a few voices dared to question the tide. Jean-Marc Gaspard, a physician in Paris, took in a feral boy found in the woods and tried to educate him, not to mock, but to understand. His methods would lay the groundwork for the idea that those with intellectual disabilities could learn. Could grow. It was a fragile idea. And it did not spread quickly. Institutions began to rise, not asylums, at first, but schools. Places where different children might be taught. In Vienna, in Paris, in London. These were small, uncertain experiments. Many failed. Others quietly continued. But not everyone believed in such progress. Many still whispered old beliefs. That children born with strange features were omens. Or burdens. Or curses. And so, behind the stone walls of rising cities, in alleys and attics, the old ways persisted. Children with Down syndrome were hidden. Or used. Or, in some cruel cases, cast out. But again, as always, kindness threaded through the dark. In rural Germany, a teacher took in a boy who could not speak clearly and taught him to carve. The boy made birds out of wood. Quiet, perfect birds. And when the teacher died, the birds were found in his home, over 100 of them, each signed with a mark. A circle. A line. A kind of name. In Italy, a seamstress raised her sister's child, thought to be unteachable, and taught her to thread a needle, one slow loop at a time. The girl never spoke much. But she hummed. And when she died, the seamstress wrapped her in cloth she'd sewn herself, and buried her beneath the olive tree. None of this made it into the medical books. But it is history nonetheless. Because history is not only written in ink. It is written in care. In habit. In the decisions people make when no one is watching. And by the end of the 1700s, the world was watching more closely. Not yet with compassion. But with focus. Down syndrome still had no name. No theory. No place in the libraries of the learned. But it had a presence. And soon, it would have a witness. The 19th century rose like a tide of certainty. Steam hissed from engines, cities throbbed with soot and science, and humanity, for the first time in its long, meandering story, believed it could understand itself. Classification became the obsession. Bones, plants, diseases, everything had to be named, charted, labeled. To be known was to be measured. And to be measured was to be controlled. Into this world walked a man with a keen eye and a quiet pen. His name was John Langdon Down. He was not a famous thinker in his youth. Born in 1828 in Cornwall, England, he grew up the son of a grocer, far from the ivory towers of London. But he was observant. Curious. And most importantly, compassionate. When he entered the Royal Oldswood Asylum for Idiots in 1858, it was a place of contradiction. Half sanctuary, half prison. It housed those deemed unfit for society, the forgotten, the feared, the misunderstood. But Down saw something more. He began to observe the residents closely, not to ridicule, but to understand. And what he noticed changed history. Among the many faces he studied, there were some who shared features, round faces, upward slanting eyes, a certain gentle demeanor. He was struck not by their strangeness, but by their consistency. These were not random deformities. There was a pattern. A presence. In 1866, he published his observations in a paper with a title reflecting the flawed views of his time, Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots. Today, the title jars, colored by colonialism and pseudoscience. But inside the paper was something revolutionary. He described a specific group of individuals, marked not by failure, but by distinction. He did not yet know of chromosomes, of genes. But he knew that this was something real. He believed they shared a condition. A unique expression of humanity. And although his terminology reflected the biases of the age, calling them mongoloid, a deeply inappropriate word drawn from ethnographic confusion, his intent was not mockery. It was recognition. He saw their potential. Down believed that with care, education, and support, people with this condition could learn. Could grow. Could thrive. He pushed against the tide of hopelessness. In his own institution, Normansfield, which he later founded with his wife, he insisted on individualized attention, physical activity, music, art. The children learned to dance, to garden, to speak, in their own time. It was a glimpse of something radical, inclusion. Still, the world was not ready. Even as his ideas took root, they were wrapped in the thorns of Victorian values. Families still hid children with disabilities. Institutions still loomed. Pity and shame remained powerful tools of silence. But now, there was a name. Down syndrome. It would take another century for the condition to be truly understood. But the mirror had been tilted. A reflection had been offered. And in it, the world would slowly, painfully begin to see. Outside England, others took note. In France, Édouard Seguin advanced educational methods for those with intellectual differences, insisting that moral treatment, not force, was key. In Germany, the scientific community began to examine the condition more closely, though often through the sterile lens of pathology. But even in these sterile halls, the idea began to flicker: this was not a failure of the human body. It was a variation. And while textbooks described symptoms, families lived stories. In a village outside Prague, a midwife named Eliska helped deliver a baby with clear signs of what Down had described. The mother was frightened. The priest whispered of burdens. But Eliska, remembering a seminar in Vienna, simply smiled. "He will need patience," she said. "But he will love you more than you know." She visited them often. Taught the boy to count potatoes. To stir soup. To sing. No one wrote it down. But the boy's laughter was real, and when he died at 42, the whole village came to the funeral. Because a name, even when imperfect, is a beginning. It creates space. It pushes back the walls of ignorance. It says, this is not a mystery. This is a person. And as the 19th century drew to a close, amid the thunder of trains and telegrams, a quiet truth had been planted. The child once buried in silence had a name. And with a name comes the possibility of a future. The 20th century began with promise. Electricity lit the night. Vaccines conquered disease. Radios carried voices across oceans. Humanity stood taller than ever, confident, modern, proud. But pride, unchecked, casts long shadows. For people with Down syndrome, the new century would offer both doors and cages, each more elaborate than the last. At the turn of the century, Down syndrome was now a recognizable term in the medical community. But understanding remained shallow. The condition was seen through the narrow lens of limitation, defined by what a person could not do, rather than who they were. Institutions swelled in size. Across Europe and America, asylums were repurposed into schools for the feeble-minded. The language was changing, but not the purpose. These were not places of learning. They were warehouses. Children with Down syndrome were often taken from their families and placed behind walls. Sometimes with consent. Sometimes without. Doctors told mothers, it's best for everyone. That the child would never walk. Never speak. Never understand. But they were wrong. Inside those institutions, behind cold metal beds and locked doors, there were children who danced to music only they could hear. Who laughed when a bird perched on the windowsill. Who hugged too long? Who remembered birthdays? Who cried when others cried? They were not broken. They were not incapable. They were simply left behind. And then came the darkest chapter. In the 1930s, the eugenics movement, once fringe, entered the mainstream. The idea was simple and terrifying, that some lives were worth more than others. That intelligence, beauty, strength should be bred like livestock. That imperfection was not diversity, but disease. This belief took hold in textbooks, in courtrooms, in public policy. In the United States, thousands of people with intellectual disabilities were sterilized against their will, for the good of society. Judges signed the orders. Doctors performed the procedures. Families were told it was mercy. But the true horror was yet to come. In Nazi Germany, eugenics became law. The T4 program, named for the address of its headquarters, Tiergartenstrasse 4, authorized the murder of people deemed life unworthy of life. Children with Down syndrome were among the first victims. Doctors visited homes, promised special care. Families signed papers, thinking they were sending their child to a better hospital. Instead, they were sending them to death. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Injections of phenol. Starvation. Between 1939 and 1945, over 200,000 people with disabilities were murdered under this program. Their names are mostly lost. Their photos remain, black and white portraits of children with soft smiles, messy hair, holding toys. They were not threats. They were not dangerous. They were different. And for that, they were erased. Yet even here, at the edge of horror, there were sparks of defiance. Some families hid their children in cellars. Others lied to officials, faking deaths or disguising identities. Nuns in Catholic convents created false baptism records. Some doctors, at great personal risk, falsified diagnoses to protect lives. Not all resisted. But some did. And because of them, some children survived. After the war, the world awoke with blood on its hands. The atrocities of the T4 program horrified the public. And in the shock that followed, a reckoning began. Slowly, painfully, the narrative shifted. Down syndrome was no longer seen only through the lens of defect. Advocates, many of them parents, began to speak. To write. To organize. In the 1950s and 60s, parent associations formed across Europe and North America. Mothers refused to institutionalize their children. They demanded education, support, visibility. And in 1959, a discovery changed everything. A French geneticist named Jérôme Lejeune, studying chromosomes under a microscope, found that individuals with Down syndrome had an extra copy of chromosome 21. It was not a curse. Not divine punishment. Not moral failure. It was biology. A simple twist of nature. A third chromosome, where there should be two. And with that discovery, the story shifted again, from blame to biology, from superstition to science. But understanding is not the same as acceptance. And though the path forward had begun, it remained steep. Still, the tide was turning. Because when a name becomes a face, and a face becomes a story, the world can no longer look away. The second half of the 20th century began not with grand revolutions, but with thousands of small ones, quiet rebellions inside kitchens, clinics, and classrooms. And at the heart of these rebellions were parents. Mothers who refused to send their newborns away. Fathers who said no when doctors suggested institutionalization. Sisters who pushed wheelchairs into sunlight. Brothers who taught their siblings to whistle. The world had changed. And it was changing still. In 1960, in an ordinary suburban home in the United States, a woman named Catherine celebrated her son's 5th birthday. His name was David. He had Down syndrome. The party was small, just family. But the moment was revolutionary. Because David still lived at home. 10 years earlier, that would have been unthinkable. Across Europe, too, the tide was shifting. In Sweden, families began forming support networks. In the UK, advocacy groups sprang up, many run entirely by parents. They met in basements, libraries, coffee shops. They shared stories, strategies, hope. One mother said, "We stopped asking what our children couldn't do. We started asking what we hadn't tried." Education became the battleground. For decades, children with Down syndrome had been excluded from schools. Told they were unteachable. But parents pushed back. And slowly, the doors opened. Special education programs emerged, not perfect, but present. Teachers began receiving training. Classrooms began to adapt. Children once silenced were now given crayons, books, and voices. Some of them flourished. They learned letters. They sang in school plays. They made friends. They struggled, yes, but so did everyone else. And for the first time in history, children with Down syndrome grew up not in shadows, but in communities. In 1971, the World Health Organization officially replaced the outdated and offensive term Mongolism with Down syndrome. It was a small change on paper, but a seismic shift in language. It marked the beginning of respect. Still, prejudice lingered. People stared. Whispered. Assumed. In job interviews, on buses, in hospitals, barriers remained. But now, the difference was this: people with Down syndrome had begun to speak for themselves. In the 1980s and 90s, a new generation came of age, one that had grown up at home, gone to school, and dared to dream bigger. They appeared on television. Acted in plays. Marched in protests. Some wrote poetry. Others danced. A few even fell in love and got married. They had desires. Opinions. Aspirations. They were no longer just subjects of care, they were subjects of their own stories. And the world began to notice. In Canada, a young man named Paul became the first person with Down syndrome hired by a major airline, greeting passengers at the gate with the brightest smile in the airport. In Ireland, Sarah, a woman with Down syndrome, earned a degree in fine arts and exhibited her paintings in galleries. In Japan, a theater company formed, composed entirely of actors with intellectual disabilities. Their performances left audiences in tears. And in 1989, the first World Down Syndrome Congress was held in Jerusalem. Families, doctors, teachers, and, most importantly, people with Down syndrome gathered to share, to celebrate, and to push forward. It was a milestone. Not because it solved every problem, but because it proved what should have been obvious all along. People with Down syndrome belong. Not in institutions. Not in isolation. But in life, in messy, joyful, ordinary life. Still, the journey was far from over. For every school that opened its doors, another still said no. For every job offer, a dozen rejections followed. For every headline of success, countless quiet struggles went unnoticed. But change had momentum now. And momentum is hard to stop. Technology offered new tools, speech devices, educational software, online communities. Information traveled faster. Advocates organized globally. Awareness campaigns spread. March 21st was declared World Down Syndrome Day, in honor of the extra 21st chromosome. And perhaps most powerful of all, a shift in perception. From tragedy, to variation. From burden, to beauty. From what is wrong, to what is different. And in that shift, an entire generation found something that their ancestors never had. Permission. Permission to live fully. To try. To fail. To laugh. To cry. To matter. Because for the first time in history, they weren't just being included. They were being heard. The 21st century arrived not with fireworks, but with reflection. After a century of unthinkable cruelty and hard-won progress, humanity paused, just briefly, to ask, what kind of world do we want to build? For people with Down syndrome, the answers have been complex. The walls of institutions have crumbled. The gates of schools and workplaces have widened. But inclusion is not a finish line, it is a daily act of intention. And that act still struggles to be universal. In wealthy nations, children with Down syndrome now attend school alongside their peers. Some take part in mainstream classrooms, others in tailored programs. But the key is presence. Visibility. Interaction. Because when children grow up knowing difference, they grow up unafraid of it. The power of visibility cannot be overstated. Today, people with Down syndrome model for clothing brands. They act in television dramas. They speak at the United Nations. They run marathons. They publish books. They vote. They date. They dance on TikTok. And yet, beneath the surface of all this progress, lies a silent tension. With the rise of prenatal testing, prospective parents can now learn, as early as the first trimester, whether their child carries the extra chromosome. For some, it is an invitation to prepare. For others, a decision point. In countries like Iceland and Denmark, the vast majority of pregnancies with a Down syndrome diagnosis are terminated. The statistics are not abstract, they're chilling. In some regions, the birth of a child with Down syndrome has become rare. Not by chance. By choice. This is not the result of cruelty, but of fear. Fear of hardship. Fear of judgment. Fear of not being enough, for the child, or for themselves. But it raises an uncomfortable question. As we move closer to eliminating suffering, are we also erasing those who have always taught us about love that asks nothing in return? Activists call it the new eugenics, not enforced by the state, but by societal pressure. By medical counsel. By absence of support. And yet, amid these storm clouds, there are voices rising. Parents who say, "I was scared. And I'm so glad I said yes." Young adults with Down syndrome who speak into microphones and say, "I love my life." Siblings who say, "They made me more patient, more kind, more human." Doctors, too, are learning. Counseling is changing. More are trained now not just to deliver information, but to offer balance. Not just the challenges, but the joys. And the truth is this: raising a child with Down syndrome is not always easy. But no child is ever easy. And ease has never been the measure of worth. In some countries, legislation has caught up with values. People with Down syndrome have legal protections, access to education, workplace accommodations, healthcare. In others, the fight continues. But what defines this era is not the law. It is the conversation. The question is no longer, can they, but will we let them? Will we let them speak? Learn? Try? Fail? Rise? Will we let them shape the world with their hands, not just be shaped by it? Because that's the frontier now, not biology, not capability, but belonging. In Portugal, a cafe is run entirely by people with disabilities, and business is booming. In Argentina, a man with Down syndrome was elected to city council. In Canada, a couple celebrated 25 years of marriage, both born with the condition. Their secret? Laughter, and mutual stubbornness. And in living rooms around the world, families are finding that the child they feared becomes the heart of the household. It's not about exceptionalism. Not every person with Down syndrome is a public speaker or athlete or artist. They shouldn't have to be. Their right to exist isn't tied to achievement. It's tied to being human. To loving. To being loved. To waking up, brushing teeth, laughing at bad TV, getting annoyed in traffic, spilling cereal on the floor, dancing alone in the hallway. Ordinary life. That's the real victory. And so, as the world spins faster, driven by technology, filtered through screens, obsessed with perfection, the story of Down syndrome offers something sacred. A reminder. That slowness is not failure. That softness is not weakness. That presence is enough. That every life, even the ones we once tried to erase, can be full of meaning, if only we let it unfold. Inclusion is a word often spoken with pride. Schools include. Workplaces include. Communities include. It sounds final, even triumphant. But inclusion, if it is only about letting someone in, still assumes the door belongs to someone else. True belonging begins when no one questions your place in the room to begin with. For people with Down syndrome, that shift, from inclusion to belonging, is the great challenge of the present. It begins early. In classrooms where teachers don't just make room, but redesign the room entirely. Where lesson plans are shaped around all minds, not just the typical ones. Where success is measured in growth, not comparison. Children with Down syndrome thrive in such spaces, not because their needs are minimized, but because they are met. In Finland, early childhood programs use mixed ability playgroups as a foundation. Children grow up seeing difference as ordinary. As expected. As human. The result? Fewer barriers later. fewer assumptions. Because bias is not born, it is taught. And so, too, is acceptance. In adolescence, the challenge deepens. Friendships grow more complex. Social circles tighten. Teenagers with Down syndrome often face isolation, not because they lack interest or affection, but because others step back. Here, belonging is not institutional, it's intimate. It looks like being invited to a birthday party, being texted, being missed when absent. And in some schools and communities, it's working. Peer mentoring programs, inclusive sports leagues, co-creative arts initiatives, they don't just involve people with Down syndrome. They are shaped with them, from the ground up. Still, this is not yet the norm. In many countries, especially outside urban centers, the resources are uneven. Support depends on zip code. Teachers are overworked. Programs underfunded. And families remain the backbone, navigating red tape, pushing for services, filling in every gap with love and exhaustion. The journey to adulthood brings new questions. Can I live on my own? Can I work? Can I fall in love? For many, the answer is yes, if systems allow it. Supported housing exists, where individuals can live with varying degrees of independence. Vocational programs offer real skills, not just token tasks. Some businesses embrace neurodiversity, recognizing that people with Down syndrome often bring loyalty, joy, and focus to the workplace. But others still see risk, or inconvenience, or legal liability. Belonging demands risk, on both sides. It asks employers to reimagine what productivity looks like. It asks communities to move at different paces. It asks us all to value contribution over speed. Romantic love remains one of the most complex frontiers. People with Down syndrome experience desire, heartbreak, infatuation, commitment, just like anyone else. But their relationships are often scrutinized, doubted, infantilized. In some places, marriage is discouraged. In others, outright forbidden. Yet across the globe, couples walk hand in hand, kiss under streetlights, argue about dishes, plan futures together. Their love is no less real for being questioned. Because love is not a benchmark, it is a birthright. In the media, portrayals are changing. Slowly. Television shows cast actors with Down syndrome not just in supporting roles, but as leads. Not as symbols, but as characters. With flaws, with jokes, with agency. Documentaries share stories not from the outside in, but from within. One young woman, in a film about her daily life, looks into the camera and says, "I don't want people to clap because I got dressed today. I want them to stop staring when I walk into a room." Her voice is calm. But it is a revolution. And that is where the movement is now. Not just demanding space, but rewriting the terms of space. Asking not just for entry, but for equity. Belonging means not having to explain yourself. It means the question is no longer, what are your limitations, but what are your dreams? And dreams, for people with Down syndrome, are as varied as the stars. To be a chef. To dance ballet. To raise chickens. To be a mom. To design shoes. To travel the world. To find someone who laughs at the same things. They are dreams that matter. Not because they are exceptional, but because they are ordinary. And in that ordinariness lies the most radical truth of all. That people with Down syndrome are not inspirational stories. They are people. There's a question that echoes quietly behind every conversation about disability. It isn't shouted. It's whispered, buried in data, softened by euphemism. That question is, what kind of people do we want in the world? It's not a medical question. It's not even ethical, not at first. It's emotional, cultural, philosophical. And for centuries, people with Down syndrome have lived as the answer to someone else's version of that question. Sometimes they've been the evidence of divine punishment. Sometimes they've been seen as blessings in disguise. Sometimes as burdens. Sometimes as heroes. But rarely, have they simply been allowed to be. To be messy. To be complicated. To be unremarkable. And yet, this is what true humanity demands. Because no one is a lesson. No one is born to teach others patience, or gratitude, or perspective. People with Down syndrome do not exist to inspire. They exist to live. And life is never a straight line. It is filled with contradiction. A young man with Down syndrome may struggle to articulate complex emotions, yet deliver perfect comedic timing that brings a room to tears. A woman might need support managing her finances but remember the birthdays of every person she meets, and ask sincerely about their grandmother's health. Their strengths are not compensation for their challenges. They are simply theirs. In truth, every human being is a mosaic of gifts and needs. But society too often treats certain traits as more valuable than others. Intelligence, speed, efficiency, independence. But what about presence? What about the ability to listen without distraction? To forgive without calculation? To delight in things others dismiss? In many ways, the traits most commonly associated with Down syndrome, gentleness, sincerity, emotional warmth, are not deficits. They are antidotes. And perhaps this is what unsettles people most. Because we live in a world that rewards the sharpest edges, the fastest minds, the most competitive spirits. And then along comes someone who slows things down. Who repeats a story. Who doesn't care about social ladders. Who laughs too loud, hugs too long, and remembers how you like your tea. They do not fit the system. But maybe the system was never worthy of them. There are cultures where this truth is felt more deeply. In New Zealand, the Maori language has no word for disability. Instead, they speak of wanohaua, families that breathe differently. The difference is not in value, but in rhythm. In parts of rural India, families speak of children with Down syndrome as slow stars, ones that move across the sky at their own pace, never hurried, never lost. In Uganda, traditional songs include lines about those who smile with the whole face. It's not a diagnosis. It's a tribute. These perspectives don't erase the difficulties. They simply don't define the person by them. Because ultimately, that's the work. That's the revolution. To see the whole person. Not a syndrome. Not a set of needs. Not a medical code or a funding category. But a full, complex, contradictory human being, capable of annoying you, of dazzling you, of disappointing you, of surprising you. Just like anyone else. And when that shift happens, not in policy, but in perception, a kind of healing begins. Not just for people with Down syndrome. For everyone. Because their story is not separate from ours. It is ours. It reveals what we celebrate. What we fear. What we think love is supposed to look like. What we think matters. Who we think matters. They are the mirror we hold up to ourselves, and the reflection is honest. Sometimes uncomfortably so. Because if we cannot see the full humanity in someone with Down syndrome, we will never fully accept our own imperfections either. But when we do, when we stop asking how to fix, and start asking how to connect, something astonishing happens. We begin to see. Not with the eyes of pity. Not through the lens of utility. But with recognition. We see a young man brushing crumbs off his shirt before a date. We see a little girl carefully arranging her dolls, all of whom have names. We see an old woman laughing at a joke she's told 100 times, just to hear someone else smile. We see ourselves, not separate, not superior, not charitable, but shared. And in that sharedness lies the future. History is not a straight road. It is a weaving path, shaped by choices, large and small. And when it comes to Down syndrome, the path has been carved by decisions made in hospital rooms, classrooms, courtrooms, and kitchens. Because it is in the kitchen, over a cup of tea, where the hard questions are often asked. A new parent sits across from a doctor. The room is quiet. A diagnosis has been delivered. The air feels heavy. And then comes the question, spoken or not, can I do this? The truth? No one can answer that for them. But what matters is this, they're not asking can the child live? Or will the child suffer? They're asking am I enough? It's a question rooted in fear. In love. In honesty. And it echoes through every generation. 50 years ago, parents were told not to take the baby home. Today, they're told the choice is theirs. Progress. But also, burden. Because while choice is a powerful right, it is also a weight. And too often, it's made in isolation. Shaped by bias, by outdated information, by quiet social pressure that says, you can choose love, but are you ready to pay for it? And yet, in homes around the world, thousands do choose. They choose the longer road. The uncertain one. The one with more appointments, more questions, more late-night doubts. But also, more firsts. The first time their child says, Mama. The first time they tie a shoe. The first time they run across a playground, laughing so hard they trip. The first time a stranger kneels down and says, you have a beautiful smile. These are not guarantees. But they are possibilities. And that is all any of us ever get. Life is never promised. Not for any child. The difference is that some lives come with a script, easy to read, predictable, linear. Others come handwritten, in looping, smudged ink. You have to read them slowly. Sometimes aloud. Sometimes together. People with Down syndrome often live lives of surprising contrast. Some grow old surrounded by family, with routines that bring peace. Others move into group homes and thrive with structure. Some find partners. Others find purpose in solitude. Some work full-time jobs. Others attend day programs focused on social connection. There is no single story. And that is perhaps the greatest truth of all. Down syndrome is not a life sentence. It is not a tragedy. It is not a guarantee of joy, either. It is a condition. One thread in a tapestry. And the question that matters most is not, what kind of life will this person have? It's, what kind of world will we build around them? Because the world shapes the person. Not the other way around. When schools are supportive, children succeed. When communities are welcoming, independence grows. When employers are open-minded, potential is realized. When media is honest, perceptions shift. It is not the chromosome that limits people. It is the environment. The expectation. The story. And we are the storytellers now. Every conversation we have. Every stare we choose not to give. Every accommodation we advocate for. Every child we raise to ask better questions. These are the tools we use to write the next chapter. And that chapter is not about perfection. It's about belonging. A belonging so deep, so instinctive, that a child born with an extra chromosome is not seen as a deviation, but simply as another variation of the human form. Because that is what they are. A reminder that nature does not mass-produce. It creates with nuance. With error. With brilliance. With care. And when we embrace that truth, fully, unapologetically, we don't just change the lives of people with Down syndrome. We change what it means to be human. Legacy is often imagined as something grand, etched in stone, taught in schools, wrapped in ribbon at the end of a long life. But for most of us, legacy isn't loud. It's quiet. It lingers in rooms we leave behind, in habits passed down, in names remembered softly. And for people with Down syndrome, legacy has often been written without them. For centuries, their stories were told about them, not by them. But that is changing. The most powerful shift of our age is not scientific or political. It's narrative. For the first time in history, people with Down syndrome are not just part of the world, they're part of the conversation about the world. And they're telling their own stories. Some of these stories are shared in books, memoirs, picture books, children's tales. Others come through blogs, podcasts, or short films. A young woman in the Netherlands records daily videos showing her routines, her thoughts, her frustrations. One day she says, "I have Down syndrome. But that's not the most interesting thing about me." Then she laughs and flips the camera to her cat. A teenager in Sao Paulo writes poems. In one of them he says, "My thoughts are not slow, they just walk to music." These aren't slogans. They're truths, shared plainly, joyfully, defiantly. And they form a legacy that grows with each telling. In many ways, this legacy is lived more than documented. It's in the teacher who, after 20 years of standardized practice, rewrites her curriculum so a child with Down syndrome can participate fully, not in a corner, not as a guest, but as a classmate. It's in the grocery store manager who shifts the schedule so her employee with Down syndrome can catch the late bus home with a friend. It's in the mother who walks into yet another IEP meeting, exhausted, firm, and smiling, ready to fight for what her child needs, again. These moments don't make headlines. But they leave echoes. And sometimes, those echoes ripple into transformation. In 2021, a young man named Emile from Belgium became the first person with Down syndrome to serve on a city's cultural advisory board. He wasn't chosen as a gesture. He was chosen because his ideas made sense. He proposed public benches designed for longer conversations. He said, "Some people talk slow. That doesn't mean their thoughts are less important." The motion passed unanimously. In Kenya, a small village school with limited resources found a way to adapt its curriculum for a boy with Down syndrome. His name was Tendo. He couldn't read fluently, but he could fix bicycles. So they built a mini workshop. Now the school teaches reading, and also gears and grease. Tendo is the best mechanic in the district. And the children bring him their broken toys, not because he's special, but because he's good. And in Japan, a grandmother started a tea ceremony group that included her grandson and 3 other teens with Down syndrome. She didn't do it for awareness. She did it because she missed calmness in her life, and they brought it back. Now every Tuesday, they sit in silence. They bow. They serve. They sip. And the room fills not with pity, but with presence. That is legacy. Not statues, not awards. But the quiet normalization of being seen, of being needed. Because for so long, the world asked of people with Down syndrome, "What can you do?" The real question is, what have we denied them the chance to try? And the answer to that is more than we'd like to admit. But now, the balance is shifting. Because every time someone chooses to listen instead of speak for, every time a school adapts instead of excludes, every time a job is offered based on kindness, not just speed, a new kind of story is written. And it says, "You belong here." Not because you inspire us. Not because you overcome something. But because you are. That is the quiet legacy being built every day, in ordinary homes, in small towns, in busy cities. It's a legacy of enough. Of wholeness without condition. And its authors are not just the people with Down syndrome, but everyone who sees them clearly, who says, "You do not have to prove your worth to be part of this world. Because your worth was never in question." The world moves fast now. Faster than thought, faster than feeling. Notifications blink, screens scroll endlessly, conversations dart past meaning into noise. Productivity is measured in minutes. Value in output. Identity in likes. In such a world, people who move slowly are often left behind. But maybe slowness is not a flaw. Maybe it's a gift. People with Down syndrome often inhabit time differently. They notice things others miss. They pause. They repeat. They insist on understanding before moving on. They laugh longer. They listen with their whole face. They stop and be, while the rest of us rush to do. It can be frustrating, yes. But also, clarifying. Because in their slowness, we see what we've been sprinting past. A conversation without distraction. A meal eaten without multitasking. A walk that's about the sky, not the destination. A hug that doesn't break too soon. And it's in these moments that something shifts. not in them. In us. We begin to remember that life is not measured only by speed or success. It's measured by depth. By connection. By the quiet knowledge that someone is glad you exist, no matter what you achieve today. There is a story from a family in Oregon. Their daughter, Sophia, was born with Down syndrome. Doctors warned of delays. Therapists spoke of milestones in years, not months. But one afternoon, when Sophia was 5, her father watched her sit beside their dog on the porch. She gently brushed its ears, humming a tune only she seemed to know. She wasn't practicing a skill. She wasn't checking a box. She was simply being, fully there. And her father wrote later, in that moment, I realized she wasn't behind. We were ahead, too far ahead to notice what mattered. This is not romanticism. It's recognition. Not every moment is peaceful. Not every day feels meaningful. Some mornings begin with frustration. Some nights end in exhaustion. But slowly, over time, families speak of something they hadn't expected, transformation. Not in their child. In themselves. They become more patient. More observant. More tender. Less concerned with comparison. More attuned to joy. Not performative joy. Not the kind posted online for applause. But quiet joy. Like the feeling of a small hand slipping into yours without a word. Like the giggle that breaks out in the middle of a hard day. Like the pure focus of a child lining up toy animals just so. These moments teach us something the world forgets. That attention is love. That time is a gift. That presence is power. And people with Down syndrome offer that presence, not always, not perfectly, not as saints, but as themselves. Fully. Freely. They show up in the world with honesty that startles. They say what they feel. They mean what they say. They forgive. They ask again. They believe. And in doing so, they create space for others to do the same. In Italy, there is a bakery staffed by people with disabilities. Customers come for the bread, yes. But they stay for the way the cashier asks, "How is your heart today?" In New York, a choir performs songs chosen by its members with Down syndrome. One woman insists on singing a lullaby at every concert, because, she says, everyone is tired. In a small town in South Korea, a man with Down syndrome runs a one-room library. He doesn't shush anyone. He just greets them with tea. And when people ask for a book, he sometimes says, "This one helped me feel better. Maybe it will help you too." These are not productivity metrics. They are not economic outputs. They are human offerings. And they remind us that value is not in what we produce. It's in how we relate. How we witness each other. How we listen. How we slow down long enough to notice who is already in the room. So often, the story of Down syndrome has been told in terms of overcoming. But perhaps that's the wrong frame. Because what if the greatest gift is not what people with Down syndrome overcome, but what they help the rest of us unlearn? The need to rush. The obsession with perfection. The fear of being different. And in that unlearning, we make space. Not just for them. For us. For the parts of ourselves we've buried, softness, wonder, vulnerability, stillness. Because in their presence, we find permission to be fully human again. Not faster. Not better. Just here. Together. Imagine a long table. Not polished. Not perfect. Just welcoming. Covered in mismatched plates. Crumbs from dinner still on the cloth. Laughter echoing from one end to the other. The kind of table where no one needs to ask if they belong. Now imagine a seat there, reserved for someone with Down syndrome. Not as a guest. Not as a favor. As family. Because that's the image this story has always been moving toward. Not headlines. Not heroics. A seat at the table. A place in the world where no one asks, "Why are you here?" Where presence doesn't need to be justified. Where difference isn't spotlighted, but simply part of the setting. Like salt. Or sunlight. Or music. And the truth is, we're closer than ever. There are more people with Down syndrome alive today than at any other time in history. More are living longer, fuller, freer lives. Life expectancy has more than doubled in the last 50 years. Education is more available. Friendships more possible. Futures more open. But the seat at the table must be more than symbolic. It must come with access. With support. With listening. And, perhaps most of all, with the willingness to change how the table is built. Because inclusion doesn't mean inviting someone in and asking them to sit still while we carry on. It means asking, how do we need to shift, so you're truly part of this? And that question reaches far. Into classrooms, where students with Down syndrome contribute not just by being present, but by shaping the learning experience. Into workplaces, where tasks are reimagined, and dignity isn't tied to a paycheck, but to participation. Into friendships, where patience isn't charity, but mutuality. Into legislation, where protections are not about exception, but about justice. And into homes, where families stop asking, will they be okay? And start asking, what kind of life do they dream of? Because that is the heart of it. Not survival. Not accommodation. But agency. The right to decide. To risk. To choose joy. To make mistakes. To start over. In recent years, self-advocacy among people with Down syndrome has grown. Conferences feature panels not about them, but led by them. Art exhibitions center their vision. Social media allows voices to rise unfiltered. They speak for themselves now. One man at a global summit stood up and said, "I am not your project. I am your peer." The room went silent. Then rose in applause. Because there's power in hearing someone claim their own life. Not in defiance. In simple truth. It is the same power that has always stirred this movement forward, not pity, not policy, but love. Not the sanitized kind. The real kind. The kind that shows up. That listens longer. That gets it wrong and tries again. That doesn't ask for perfection, but presence. And through this love, we reshape the world. One conversation. One classroom. One open door. Until that table is no longer remarkable. Until it simply is. Where a person with Down syndrome sits beside an artist, a teacher, a grandmother, a student. All eating, talking, laughing, living. Where no one needs to raise their voice to be heard. Where no one is the exception. Where the story doesn't end with tragedy or triumph, but with belonging. That's the ending we write now. Not with grand declarations, but with small, ordinary choices, made again and again, with care. Because the most radical act is not to change the world. It's to let someone fully exist within it. And when we do, we find that the table was never full. There has always been space. We only needed to notice.